Okay, I'd like to welcome all of you. It's quite a crowd today.
I do that, but I figured I'd put their paper. Now I'm going to regret it.
I'd like to welcome all of you to Foreshadowing the Present, the Legacies of Theodor Reik. My name's Carl Jacobs, and I'm program chair at the National Psychological Association for Psychoanalysis. And today's conference is co-sponsored by the NPAP and the New School Bachelor's Division, Department of Social Science, and the Graduate Department of Psychology. Our thanks go to Dr. Gustav Peoples, Dr. Miriam Steele, Pam Tillis, and Mary Doctor. And I'd like to also welcome some special guests this morning. First is Irene Sofer, who is Theodor Reik's daughter. Mignon Reik, who is Theodor Reik's son's wife, and their daughter, Daniela Reik. Also, I'd like to welcome Annabelle Nelkin, who is the registrar at NPAP for almost all the time that Theodor Reik was there. Okay, get started. Adam Phillips, in his book, Terrors and Experts, ended a chapter that he named Sexes with this quote: "Human beings are self-surprising creatures. If in our sexuality we are full of surprises, we are also, by the same token, keen to take the edge off our desire, eager to deaden ourselves. This is what Freud referred to as the battle between Eros and Thanatos, the hot war between aliveness and inertia. Freud showed us that there are surprises on both sides," unquote. Theodor Reik showed us it was the surprises that mattered most. Beginning with New Ways in Psychoanalytic Technique in 1933 and Surprise in the Psychoanalyst in 1936, and Listening with the Third Ear in 1948, Reik showed the way for psychoanalysts to bridge the gap between theory and practice. Theodor Reik died on December 31st, 1969. It was the official last day of the 1960s. After some 40 years, I just recently began to wonder about that date. And since I'm what one might call a child of the 60s, it got me to thinking about Theodor Reik's work in a new and different way. Since his death, NPAP has celebrated his life and work more than once. But each time, it seems, his legacy falls deeper and deeper into some sort of analytic abyss. As the 60s ended, there did come a new generation of analytic candidates, students from fields other than medicine who began to study psychoanalysis. To put Reik's death into historical analytic perspective, it was just at the time that Heinz Kohut created his self-psychology, after he was rejected as president of the International in Rome. I point to this as relevant since we all know that Kohut, while quite courageous, never seemed to give credit to others who had preceded him. Reik's focus on empathic communication, long before Kohut's focus, is a case in point. Back in the 1920s and the early 1930s, there was another controversy brewing. Freud had developed his structural theory, opening up the potential for the misnamed ego psychology. Wilhelm Reich's character analysis, based on the systematic analysis of resistances, was a masterpiece. But Reik already was in touch with an alternate theory of treatment, which he wrote about in New Ways in Psychoanalytic Technique. And so the Reich controversy proceeded. It would later develop into a finical Reich controversy. But at the heart of these differences was a conflict over the technique of psychoanalysis. Freud's dispute with Ferenczi over Ferenczi's active technique may have led Freud to write his analysis terminable and interminable, and possibly even his Moses paper. But this same issue of technique was probably at the heart of Reich's famous dispute with the New York Psychoanalytic Institute. For Reik, it was intuition that was foremost. Reik once said, and I'm quoting, "We react to the unconscious with all our organs, with our various instruments of perception and comprehension. The word empathy sometimes means one thing, sometimes another, until now it does not mean anything at all." That was in 1948. To my mind, intuition is simply the combining of both empathy and trust in human and animal communication. Remember that in the 1940s, the New York Psychoanalytic Institute was embedded in the ego psychology paradigm. I can't imagine how, as an institution, they could have appreciated Reich's intuitive approach to the technique of unconscious to unconscious communication. Even in the late 70s, I remember attending meetings at New York Psychoanalytic after they had removed the rope between members and guests, but it still felt like an invisible Berlin Wall still existed. If Reich had had the narcissism of a Lacan, he might have developed his own school. Instead, he influenced Lacan's theory of technique. But while both Lacan and Reich were analysts who favored Freud's early theories, both felt a discomfort with the Freud, Hartman, Anna-Freud developments of ego psychology. Of course, Bion felt the same way, and in my opinion, developed his own version of ego psychology. While Melanie Klein, like Reich, loyal to Freud, developed her own version of an object relations approach. I bring these names up at this conference because we're trying to explore and explicate the influences on our current dilemmas in the world of psychoanalysis. Pluralism and diversity is all well and good, and may even be evolutionary in terms of the development of theory. But the psychoanalytic world and its collective ego has fragmented over this diversity and pluralism. The debate between science, art, or philosophy continues. An example is a recent issue of the International Journal in the newly formed education section. Jorge Canestri gathered 3 analysts from the different regions of the International to write about the concept of truth in psychoanalysis. Philip Bromberg, an astute and prominent relational analyst, discussed his version of what he calls, or prefers to call, interpersonal relational. When he gets to the core of his theoretical discussion, he uses some brief neuroscientific references to bolster his concept that therapeutic action takes place in what he calls safe surprises. He gives a compelling and interesting argument, but as others have done, he fails to credit Theodor Reik. I've spoken to Dr. Bromberg, and I know he has read Reik and holds him in high esteem, and yet the question remains, why Reik is not given his due? Theodor Reik, whose 26 books, although he has told Martin Bergman it was 40 books, and hundreds of communications, have given us the ability to focus on the nature of what psychoanalysis is. But this has been all but lost in the proliferation of new schools of psychoanalysis over the last 40 years. Let me approach just one piece of the puzzle of Theodor Reik. As we are aware, Reik was the first person to write a doctoral thesis using psychoanalytic theory. This was the beginning of applied psychoanalysis. Freud appreciated this and foresaw the day when psychoanalysis would not be a handmaiden of medicine. but would represent psychology. His reasons for defending Reik with his monograph was not simply as an analytic father protecting an analytic son, but I believe it was a way for Freud to expand his vision for psychoanalysis beyond a medical technique. When Strachey wrote his famous paper on the therapeutic action of psychoanalysis, he was putting forth the notion of an allopathic medical technique in which it is the analyst's interpretation which is the curative factor. Reik's book, Surprise in the Psychoanalyst, was the counterpoint to Strachey's approach, what I would call a more homeopathic vision for psychoanalysis. Welcome, Martin. A more homeopathic vision for psychoanalysis in which it is the patient who cures herself after the analyst, using an understanding of his own unconscious, that is, self-analysis, titrates interpretations that stimulate a similar surprise in the patient. In a letter to Oscar Pfister, Freud once wrote, quote, "I do not know if you detected the secret link between the lay analysis and the illusion. In the former, I wish to protect analysis from the doctors, and in the latter, from the priests. I should like to hand it over to a profession which does not yet exist, a profession of lay curers of the soul who need not be doctors and should not be priests." So again, we see a Reich-Strachey controversy that in its early development was foreshadowing what today Monroe Prey has called the classical relational schism. We can all see in the analytic literature of today and of the past 20 to 30 years a lack of references prior to 1980. The relational turn, often associated with that generation of analysts whom we can call children of the 60s, have bypassed credit to earlier analysts in their attempt to find equal status with what they coined as the hegemonic ego-psychological paradigm. In a short period, the relational turn has subsumed Kohut's self-psychology, Sullivan's interpersonal, as well as the intersubjective movement and parts of object relational theories. I've spoken to many defenders of the relational turn about Reich, and it is clear that they have failed, at least in public disclosure, to credit him with the originality that he is due. In private, however, many relational luminaries readily acknowledge Reich's seminal influence upon their thinking and their technique. Over many years, NPAP has produced analytic writers who tried to place Reich in his rightful position. Joe Reppin, Moss Ron, Zvi Lotan, Marty Schulman, Jerry Gargiulio, Mort Israel, Jane Coopersmith, and of course, the leading Reich scholar, Murray Sherman, whose close association to Reich has been the basis for many explicative papers on Reich and his legacy. But for whatever reason, Reiks Legacy has been overshadowed by the general tenure of psychoanalytic growth over the last 40 years, much in the way that analysts like Edmund Bergler or even Phyllis Greenacre have been forgotten. Reich was an extraordinarily popular analytic writer in the 40s and the 50s, during the golden age of analysis in America. He rode the wave by using non-technical language during a time when the general public was enamored with psychoanalytic thinking. Of course, this was also the time when the scientifically oriented ego psychology paradigm was extant in the literature. This controversy has not gone away. Just last year, a JAPA listserv discussion covered the same issues. And while it was quite interesting, the discussion never resolved the issue. It would appear that psychoanalysis never seems to resolve its major controversies. but rather reinvents them over and over under different forms and different argument. Reik himself was not big on formal analytic training, and yet NPAP was founded around Reik on principles of training that follow the Berlin-Eidingen model, of which Reik most likely had a large part in laying out, since he had been analyzed by Abraham. Reik was very much a part of the analytic establishment early in his career, even though his colleagues felt that he was sometimes channeling Freud. However, after NPAP was formed by students of psychoanalysis that had gathered around Reik, he remained outside of the institutional politics, which are a natural part of any institution. He was president of NPAP, but it was the board of directors and trustees who ran the show. And while controversies were always manifest, Reik seemed to remain aloof. Even so, he did form another institute in Philadelphia, which, while now defunct, did last for over 30 years. When Gisela Barenbaum, a leader in the early history of NPAP and the wife of Gus Barenbaum, a New York psychoanalytic member, didn't like what was happening at NPAP as the sociological analysts moved into prominent positions, she took her analysans, her students, and her supervisees and formed the Freudian Society. Gisela was my analytic great-grandmother, as she had analyzed my analyst's analyst. Reik never protested this split, as he never protested a later split that resulted in the formation of IPTAR. Another split from IPTAR resulted in the formation of NICAPs by Reuben Fine. Then Hyman Spotnitz left NPAP with many followers, including Benjamin Margolis, who was analyzed by Reik, to form the Modern School. And there were others. All this is to show how Reik's NPAP became the root of the family tree of New York non-medical psychoanalytic training. The impact of this can be felt, at least unconsciously, throughout the New York psychoanalytic world, which has since and currently reverberates to both the American and the international psychoanalytic communities. Much of this culminated with the famous lawsuit of the late 1980s. Lay analysis had finally come to be what Freud had always envisioned as simply psychoanalysis. I want to read you a quote from Surprise in the Psychoanalyst. Remember, this was written in the mid-1930s. Quote, "We may draw the following conclusion with regard to practical analytic technique. The analyst must approach the psychic material with a conscious openness of mind. I hold that this is a sine qua non of analytic research. Students of analysis cannot be too strongly warned against setting out to investigate the unconscious psychic processes with any definite idea of what they will find. Ideas probably derived from their conscious theoretical knowledge. As one looks back on one's own cases and listens to the account of other people's, how often one has the impression that under the influence of such pigeonhole knowledge, the gangway to reality has been hauled in much too soon, and the ship has far too quickly put out into the ocean of theory. In practice, I generally find myself becoming the more confused the more I think of familiar analytic theory when I am treating a patient. And I find my bearings again only in the chaos of the living psychic processes. To put it in a nutshell, I hold that the more important discoveries and insights in an analysis come as a surprise to analysand and analyst alike." And he goes on, "Let me commend the deliberate discarding of order and forced regulation in our technique, the lack of all system, the absence of every definite plan. Let me be permitted to declare myself the opponent of any and every mechanization of analytic technique." After Reik's death at the end of the 1960s, academia faced problems with multiculturalism, feminist studies, postmodernism, deconstruction, queer theory, and more. And from that point on, it has been next to impossible for any university to institute a general education curriculum. And in retrospect, psychoanalysis has been in the same boat. Reich's method for psychoanalysis, as a discipline, as a theory of mind, and as a philosophy, requires that very same generalized education, a background in the knowledge of the human endeavor, which could then be applied to the discipline, the theory, and the philosophy of psychoanalysis. In our neo-postmodernist world, these words seem readily understandable to large and varied groups or schools of psychoanalysis. One only need be engaged in the current aspects of analytic training to understand how difficult it is to teach psychoanalysis, not only to any specific individual candidate, but to the heterogeneous conglomeration of candidates from various backgrounds, which is our current situation. Good or bad, this is the reality of psychoanalysis in 2010. And while many of us here today may bemoan the lack of credit Reik and other visionaries have suffered, we may all come to understand that Theodor Reik's life and work may very well have contributed to this current state of diversity and pluralism that we find ourselves in today. Excuse me. Nothing less than the persistent self-understanding of continued self-analysis will suffice to understand the depth of Reik's work. From surprise to love, to lust, to masochism, to empathy, to unconscious guilt, to the haunting melody. We as analysts must listen with our third ears if we are to truly understand not just our patients, but ourselves. Back in 1980, the year I started my analytic training, Martin Grotjahn wrote a remembrance of Reik, a friend of his from Holland and a colleague here in New York. He wrote, "The writings of Sigmund Freud introduced me to psychoanalysis. The works of Theodor Reik helped me to become an analyst. Freud gave me the insight into a new world. Reik gave me courage to enter this world. Freud showed me how to think analytically and to understand the unconscious. Reik showed me how to trust intuition." Today we have psychoanalysts from most of the current schools of psychoanalysis and one who was trained by Reik, here to discuss Reiks Legacies. Each of our speakers will focus on one major issue of Reik's opus and then try to link it to the current controversies that are extant in today's analytic world. After each panel, we'll have an extended discussion of the papers that have been presented, and you'll all have a chance to not only listen with your third ears, but hopefully to be open to surprise. Our panel this morning will be comprised of Dr. Harold Blum discussing masochism and modern man, Dr. Jeremy Safran listening with the third ear, and Dr. Otto Kernberg, who gets two topics, love and lust. So let's begin. Dr. Harold Blum is the executive director of the Sigmund Freud Archives and the former editor for 10 years of the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association. He's edited major works honoring such noted analysts as Leo Rangel, Jacob Arlo, Robert Wallerstein, Mark Kanzer, and Heinz Hartmann. And he has written crucial articles in our literature on numerous topics, including femininity and extratransference interpretation. Among the many awards he has received, he was the 2006 recipient of NPAP's Oscar Sternbach Memorial Award. Dr. Harold Blum.
Thank you, Carl. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm very grateful for the invitation to speak on this distinguished panel this morning. The topic of masochism in modern man, when Carl sent me the book by Theodor Reik, the thought crossed my mind, was there a hidden agenda? But masochism, of course, extends to more than modern man. It extends back probably as far as Homo sapiens. And I think we have to take into account that there is no accepted single definition of masochism, nor any agreed upon consensual concepts of its pathogenesis and dynamics. I want to also say something about Carl's wonderful introduction and just add a few things. Perhaps it's even an aspect in a broader sense of masochism in men and women. The fact is that it's not only Reik who faded into obscurity over the years, it's been the fate of most of the analysts as time goes on, with the single exception of Sigmund Freud. If you think back, Heinz Hartmann has faded. He's hardly cited in the literature these days. Margaret Mahler faded. She is hardly cited in the literature. Anna Freud is in the process of fading. She is no longer nearly as mentioned, as cited, as in the past. The references to the pioneers, they're still there in terms of Ferenczi and Abraham, but others like Ballant, even like Rudy Lowenstein, they've all faded. We have to ask ourselves what happens. And I think of all the timeless contributions each one of these people, in a way, has made, they are very subordinate to the foundation that Freud left us, the basic foundation of psychoanalysis. And it may be that in time, all of us will be footnotes to Freud. That remains to be seen, but that seems to be the case historically, looking at psychoanalysis over the past century. So it's a pleasure to pay tribute to Reik, and I think very important that we bring back the important contributions he made to psychoanalysis, but I think we have, from a historical viewpoint, have to take into account that it's not prejudice against Reik, that it's not a feeling of opposition to Reik's ideas, so much, I think, as the historical trend, which is true, I think, of almost all the analysts. Another thing I wanted to add, too, there's a tendency to lose track historically of the contributions that have occurred over the past century. Reik did not contribute the first applied analytic paper. The first applied analytic paper, other than that by Freud, who analyzed Sophocles and Shakespeare, even in the Fleece Letters, but the first applied analytic paper was actually by Max Groff, also forgotten. He's an analyst, but he only analyzed one case, his son. Never analyzed anyone else. And Max Groff, under Freud's encouragement, produced an applied analytic analysis of Richard Wagner's Flying Dutchman. That was probably the first applied analytic paper in the literature. Freud was so enchanted with the paper that he gave Max Groff one of his own papers, Psychopathic Characters on the Stage, which was not presented to the public till many, many years later in the 1940s, when Max Groff had it published in the Psychoanalytic Quarterly. Now, to return more formally to the topic of masochism, there are many ideas about masochism, and to just mention a few, historically, Freud first proposed it as a component of libido, and it was specifically sadism at that time. Masochism was sadism turned inwards. Then Freud reversed himself, and in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, primary masochism was present from the beginning, equated in effect with the death instinct, and sadism was the projection of masochism outwards. In the economic study of masochism by Freud, he proposed 3 forms of masochism: feminine masochism, which I tried to do away with. I don't know if I succeeded. And then there was erotogenic masochism, which could result from any kind of biological, neurobiological stimulus, particularly pain, but other sources as well. And there was moral masochism, which today we think of more in terms of superego disturbance. So Freud left really and then as Carl mentioned, there was Eros and Thanatos too, where masochism and sadism become partly equated with Thanatos and partly with Eros. which brings me to the amalgamation or the coalescence or probably the fusion of different aspects of masochism. The first one was people tried to understand it in terms of the fusion of sex and aggression. Sadomasochism was a fusion of the two drives. Then there was the idea that it was a fusion of the two basic principles, pleasure and unpleasure. Then people began to think, and we've had many papers since then, this was not a point emphasized so much by Theodor Reik, but by Wilhelm Reich, the role of particularly the masochistic and sadistic pervert in achieving control and omnipotent control of the partner. So that turned into a fusion of masochism and narcissism. These are all different, really, although interrelated facets of the general problem of sadomasochism. And it's quite clear that as a pair, they always go together. One doesn't find masochism without sadism. One is on the surface, one is underneath. They're often layered. It's an overdetermined etiology, and there is no definite agreement about its origins. Theodor Reik emphasized a point that Freud, in A Child is Being Beaten, really developed. And Reich continued in Masochism and Modern Man to adhere very closely to Freud's formulation. In A Child is Being Beaten, Freud said that the beating fantasy represented primarily two qualities. One was the incestuous wish hidden in the beating, and the other one was the punishment for the incestuous wish, a compromise formation. But the incestuous wish and the punishment for the wish were really aspects of the Oedipus complex. He had moved away at that point from a purely drive theory of component instincts and the fusion of sex and aggression to an Oedipal formulation of sadomasochism in the beating fantasy. Today we think of the beating fantasies in a much more complex way, with Oedipal roots to be sure, but with also pre-Oedipal and post-Oedipal roots as well. And there's much more of an emphasis today on the role of trauma in causing very early distress and a neurobiological component and addiction to pain. Since I'm very limited in time, I wanted to bring up two clinical examples which illustrate both ideas. One very close to Theodor Reik's formulation, and he remained in his book, that's 1949, very pioneering book, but at the time staying very close to Freud's formulation of an Oedipal basis of sadomasochism. I'll try to give one very brief example of this kind of really locus of pathogenesis, as well as another aspect of what Reich said, which I am fully in agreement with for most cases, but not all. If we define masochism as the conscious or unconscious search for suffering, for defeat, for humiliation, we can take that as a pretty much given, but recognize that sometimes, as Reich pointed out, it turns out to be manifest content. That is, the search for suffering, which we regularly infer in sadomasochism, turns out to be something that really is not so much beyond the pleasure principle or a search for unpleasure as manifest content. And the wish for pleasure, the wish for erotic gratification or aggressive gratification, is very much hidden in the latent content. The other aspect I want to mention in two examples I'm going to present is the importance of pre-Oedipal components, which are pretty much missing from the 1949 book, which today we have a much better understanding of. That is, the roots of sadomasochism going back much earlier than the Oedipus complex. A quick example of that would be today our understanding of very early infant abuse and child abuse resulting in an addictive attachment to the abusive object and a search for abuse representing the object, an inability to separate from the abusive object, and sadomasochistic components in other areas of life arising in part from the early traumatic experience. Another aspect of this is Reich's attention to fantasy very much in the masochism in modern man, allied with the prevailing currents in analysis at that time. This is, although it's really written toward a period immediately after World War II, it is striking to see that the adherence to Freud and to the importance of unconscious fantasy is so great that the role of trauma, which became so prominent, it was really, in effect, unavoidable after the war and the Holocaust. But the analysts needed time to catch up and to really deal with the importance, again, of traumatic experience, which Freud never gave up. All right, let's take first, if I have time, the example, and I'll try to be very quick because I want to allow time for my co-religionists, my co-panelists here. This would be an example of masochism, which has pleasurable and gratifying aspects hidden behind the seemingly search for suffering and masochistic submission. The patient was a survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto, and he, during that time, of course, experienced all manner of sadomasochistic experience. People were being murdered right in front of his eyes. People were being maimed. Infants were being thrown to their death. Every day, killing became an everyday experience, and it was a matter of sheer survival, of kill or be killed. He ended up killing 2 of the Nazis in order to survive, and became linked with the Polish resistance, which was a matter of his survival, which also was due to luck, as well as extraordinary resourcefulness under extreme circumstances. He came into analysis with another analyst, I've reported this in the literature, who avoided the issue of the Holocaust. But here was his perversion. He had, after the war, emigrated to the United States, and in the city in which he lived, he would find that he had a need to get a particular kind of shave. He would search around the city to find a barber shop in which there was a barber with a particular kind of lifestyle and physiognomy and anatomy. He had to be not too tall, rather rotund, jowl-faced, and so forth. Alone, he would go into the barber shop, ask for a shave, and as the barber was shaving his neck under the barber sheet, he would have an erection and ejaculation. Afterwards, he would be very, very ashamed, humiliated, but he had this need to constantly repeat the perverse enactment. He had no understanding of why he had this perversion. The analyst emphasized all the Oedipal elements. As a child growing up in a Polish shtetl, he had seen the ritual slaughter of chickens by the shochet. The chickens had their throats cut. They often had their heads cut off. They would run around like chickens with their heads cut off. And he also saw the slaughter of pigs done by the Gentiles. So throat cutting and this kind of animal murder were common to his early childhood. A sister had died, and in part he was a replacement child. I don't have time to go into that. And he had many other experiences of a sadomasochistic nature. In school, his father had insisted that he go to a Polish school to learn to speak Polish properly without a Yiddish accent. So he went to school and learned flawless Polish, but in school he was the only Jew in his class, subjected to all manner of ridicule, derision, sarcasm, and actually threatened with more than circumcision. His classmates reminded him that he was already cut short and they would finish off the rest. So there was a great deal of castration anxiety along with many other determinants. Now, what became apparent that was overlooked was the triumph in the sadomasochistic perversion. He goes to the barber shop. He finds a barber who represents the Nazi. He, in that sense, is the victim, although he's identified with the Nazi. He offers his throat for the Nazi to cut. He's getting his close shave. Actually, he was a late teenager during the Warsaw Ghetto experience and had just learned to shave. So a close shave had many meanings, but it was important that this was an arrest of his adolescent development as well. Now he is going to have his throat cut, and he has this ejaculation, seemingly out of masochistic submission to the executioner. But behind that was something else entirely, which was that in my ejaculation, I preserve the power to reproduce, and I represent all my loved ones. His whole family had been annihilated, all murdered. His friends had been murdered. The entire community had disappeared, as we know. I represent all those who have been slaughtered. I am the resurrection and the life. He could have quoted John in the New Testament. I'm the resurrection and the life. He who lives in me will never die. And the ejaculation was his way of saying that I am able to reproduce, and all my loved ones, all those who were gone, will be reproduced in my semen, in my capacity for new life. And Reik, I think, was perfectly correct in saying what appeared to be masochistic submission and abject defeat was actually victory. He had seized victory from the jaws of defeat. And what seemed masochistic submission was also his own way of expressing triumph. He had not been castrated. He had an erection and an ejaculation. So in that respect, I think we owe a debt here, too, for Reik pointing out more than anyone else how the latent content of a masochistic perversion may not only represent the search for suffering and defeat, but also victory and triumph. Now, quickly, the other case. This lady was strongly identified with an obsequious masochistic mother. She grew up in the South. Father was the boss, the head of the household. Mother took orders, and she was the totally compliant, obsequious housewife. I don't think that in the past, that is the 40s and going back earlier, there was enough attention to the importance of actual identifications. That's just one root, but it was a very powerful root of this lady's masochism. She marries a man who is a kind of outwardly highly macho, rather sadistic kind of character. You know, The Perfect Marriage, the sadist and the masochist? On their wedding night, the masochist says, beat me, and the sadist says, no. Well, this was marriage of us. This was one very common form of sadomasochism, is a very quarrelsome marriage where the people are fighting all the time. And the dimension of this marriage was that there was a tremendous amount of risk-taking and getting injured, accident proneness, without any awareness that the accident proneness was actually arranged. One very important dimension of that was her husband, who was quite wealthy, drove sports cars in the most incredibly sadomasochistic fashion, with extraordinary risk-taking and many accidents. 2 times they both ended up in the hospital as a result of the accidents. The patient with a ruptured spleen and liver, and her husband with, I think, various fractures. At one point, her husband was arrested for the risky, outlandish kinds of driving. And this is another dimension of his sadomasochism. The cops arrest him, and as they're going to put him in jail, he says to the police, "You guys have small dicks." Whereupon the police beat him up. And after that, he calls his wife. My patient says, "They beat the shit out of me, get me a lawyer." And he then sues the police and wins the case for police brutality. So he enlisted the police sadomasochism in the acting out that was going on all the time. Now, at one point, he says to his wife, and I have to telescope this to be very quick. He says to his wife, with a friend present, that he wants her to have intercourse with his friend. And she, on the surface, with Daddy always being the one who's the boss, and she rationalizes, this is her conscious thinking. She rationalizes, well, this is what he wants. The hell with him. She'll have intercourse with his friend, with her husband watching. So she has intercourse with him, and one can see here the Oedipal dynamics, the primal scene. He gives mother away to father. He's too guilty to possess mother himself. And it's a homosexual submission, a masochistic submission to the father figure represented by the friend. Her dynamics are more complicated, but basically she's still the masochistic kind of totally submissive wife, hiding the fact that it's a sadistic act on her part toward him, the hell with him, and she's going to humiliate him in the process of humiliating herself. Shortly thereafter, some months later, her husband, and I'll go into the pre-Oedipal history in a moment, her husband one afternoon is very, very erotic and insists that they have intercourse. She complies in her usual masochistic fashion, and he ends up having intercourse in every possible position, frantically, in a frenzy. This is the Kama Sutra and the Sutra Kama. He's turning in every possible direction. She is not enjoying it at all, and she senses that there's something frenzied, if you will, manic about the behavior. Something that he wants from her that she either can't give or he could never get from anyone. She's not enjoying it, and he's in this frenzy of sexual activity. 2 days later, he shoots himself to death. Now, it's as if the manic phase suddenly quickly gave way to depression, and as we know, bipolars probably have the highest suicide rate of all. But there's this whole history of sadomasochistic behavior. When he was driving the car at these incredible speeds in city traffic, he was also sadistically endangering many other people, besides masochistically arranging for his own and his wife's injuries. It looks as though this is very Oedipal. But when we hear about the earlier life, we see that this is much more complex. His mother was a masked alcoholic. The parents were always quarreling from day one. When his father would take his boat down to the south, to the Florida Keys, they couldn't get, mother and father couldn't get along at all. She would take her car and drive separately. He was in the boat, she was in the car. She would drive south all the time, probably driving at least at times to keep away from him, but also probably DWI, at times driving while intoxicated. He was a very early headbanger, very serious headbanger. So there was something quite in very early life, this is the first year of life, sadomasochistic behavior right there, already indicative, if you follow the work of Spitz, of a disturbance in the primary object relationship during the first year of life. We have every reason to believe that as a very irritable, cantankerous child, a kind of holy terror, irritable, cantankerous, during the pre-Oedipal period, that the disturbance continued beyond the first year of life, right through separation, individuation, into the Oedipal period. Here, I think we have to take into account the immense importance of the pre-Oedipal antecedents of the Oedipus complex, so that the primal scene, given its sadomasochistic interpretation correctly, also has been very much determined by what had occurred earlier. And here I think we can add a great deal to masochism in modern man and to the theories of masochism so prevalent all the way up until probably until the 60s, when there began to be much more attention to pre-Oedipal factors. So with that, do I have more time or a couple more minutes? Right. And I want to say something else about one other aspect of fusion. If you look at the... Oh, sorry. Can everyone hear me now? I hope you could have heard before. I wouldn't want to repeat it. That would be sadism. But there's one other form of fusion. I had mentioned the fusion of sex and aggression, of pleasure and unpleasure, and so on. But in Freud's paper, Child is Being Beaten, which is really the classic paper on beating fantasies, Anna Freud's paper, her first paper on beating fantasies and daydreams, was really derived from her treatment by Freud. She's one of the cases in the paper, A Child is Being Beaten. I think she's case number 2. There is another kind of fusion that Freud doesn't mention, but it comes up as a compromise formation that is very important in terms of the Oedipal dynamics. And there I think we owe a great deal to Reik, which is the fusion of the pleasure and the punishment. That's another way to understand this, that the pleasure in it is inextricably interwoven with punishment. And we have to add something else here, that even in the case I described of the Holocaust survivor, the role of guilt and the guilt of the survivor is very important. Guilt and the need for punishment coalesce with masochistic strivings. So very often, when we're confronted with masochism and overt masochism, we should keep in mind the role and importance of unconscious guilt and how often these patients are not only masochistic, but guilt-ridden. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dr. Jeremy Safran is the former chair of the Graduate Psychology Department here at the New School, where he's Director of Clinical Training. He is President of the International Association of Relational Psychoanalysis and faculty at both NYU and the Stephen Mitchell Relational Center. He's author of Emotion in Psychotherapy? In Psychotherapy and Psychoanalysis and Buddhism, an Unfolding Dialogue, and Negotiating the Therapeutic Alliance, a Relational Treatment Guide. Dr. Safran.